Hi everyone. Let's take a look at Game 6 from the World Championship. Carlsen has white, Nepo has black, and it was a thrilling, record-breaking game. It was the longest game ever played in a World Championship at 136 moves, breaking the previous record set by Karpov-Korchnoi of 124 moves. So Carlsen opens with d4. We saw this in Game 2 in which he played a Catalan opening. But instead of playing c4 in this position, Carlsen goes for g3 right away. And the Lichess database calls this a pseudo-Catalan because the Catalan opening does occur with the pawn on c4. Okay, and here Carlsen could transpose back to the Catalan in the same position he had in Game 2 by playing c4, but instead he castles. Okay, and then he plays b3, holding his c-pawn back for even longer. And Jan says, if you're not going to move your c-pawn 2 squares forward, I'm going to move mine. Carlsen takes, bishop takes back. And now a surprising move to me was c4 in the position. This looks like black can just saddle white with a weak isolated c-pawn. And Jan does take on c4, but Carlsen had this planned, queen c2, pinning the pawn to the bishop, so the pawn cannot take on b3. Queen e7 protects the bishop, threatens the pawn taking on b3 again, but Carlsen just gives a pawn up here. He gambits a pawn with knight to knight b d2. Jan does not take the offered pawn. He could have. The engine says this is fine, you can take this pawn. Carlsen would get a tempo on the bishop would fall back somewhere. Maybe knight d4 is a good move, unleashing the Catalan bishop, putting pressure on the c6 square, stopping knight c6. And white has a lot of activity for his pieces. The engine says it's enough for the pawn and gives the position all zeros. But Jan doesn't take the pawn. He plays knight c6 instead. And then Carlsen takes back on c4 with his knight. Okay, b5 is an excellent move, gaining a tempo on the knight, getting ready to fianchetto the bishop. Okay, the knight goes to the center of the board. It does not retreat. Knight b4, another good move, attacking the queen. Doesn't have a great square to go to. It goes to b2. Maybe the bishop would rather be on b2. Bishop b7, and now these bishops look great on these consecutive diagonals here. a3 kicks the knight back. Then knight d3 attacks the bishop, and Jan doesn't want to give up those nice bishops there. Okay, bishop g5 threatens to fracture the kingside pawn structure by taking on f6. Rook fd8 allows that to happen. This rook is probably supporting this knight coming to the d4 square. Carlsen does take. Taking back either way is okay here, and Jan decides to keep the queens on the board, make the game more exciting. Rook a c1. The knight comes to d4 as prepared. The knights get swapped. Queen to a2. And black takes off that powerful Catalan bishop. Now, I was always taught that when you have this kind of fianchetto structure, your light squares are weak, and you want to keep your light squared bishop to protect the squares. But white's perfectly safe here because black doesn't have a light squared bishop either, and he doesn't even have a knight. So sometimes a queen and a knight could team up to attack that structure. But the white king's perfectly safe. Black does get a check, improves his queen a little bit. And then the queen comes to the center of the board, pressuring the knight, pressuring e2. The white queen comes back to c2. Taking the c-file. This does invite potentially a rook coming to the c-file, and we'll see that in a bit. Jan plays a5, rook fd1, and now a very subtle move here, king g7. Let's talk about the purpose of this move. Jan is actually intending to play rook a c8 in this position or after king g7, and this does allow Carlsen to take the two rooks for the queen like this. But in this case, this exchange comes with a check, which is good because otherwise Carlsen's e2 pawn would fall. So the king would move out a check, and then Carlsen would save his e-pawn. So that's why here Jan plays king g7. So after the exchanges, it won't come with check, and then the e2 pawn will fall. So Carlsen has to protect that pawn somehow. He opts to do it with rook d2. Another possibility was e3, but he plays rook d2, and then the rook on the a file does come to c8, and Carlsen said in the press conference he was happy to see that. This gives an opportunity to completely unbalance the position, and Carlsen is getting ready for a long game. At one point during the press conference, Carlsen said he was trying to prolong the game as long as possible. Okay, trying to tire out his opponent. So queen d5 attacks the b pawn. It pushes forward. a4, good move. You don't want to make this strategic blunder and exchange here, because then that pawn on b4 would be forever protected by the knight. There's nothing black could do to make any more progress on the queen side. But when you push that a pawn forward, it has the potential later on of becoming a queen. That a3 pawn is vulnerable. Black can attack it at some point and win it. Okay, so e3 was played, bishop e5, h4, h5, king h2, and Jan goes for that a3 pawn with bishop b2. The point is, if the knight takes the bishop, then the rook falls, or if the rook takes the bishop, then the knight falls. So Carlsen decides to do neither. He plays rook c5, queen goes to d6. That's actually a mistake according to the engine. The engine says the queen should have gone to d7. Let's see why that's a mistake. It's a mistake because of this line. White had rook c2, and the bishop can take on a3 here, but now there's a nice move, and it is not attacking the bishop, and if white did that, now we see the purpose of the queen on d6. It's helping the bishop get out, because the bishop would be able to take on b4. But that's not the move here. White would have played knight to f4, and given up another pawn on the queen side. And the point is, the two rooks and the knight are going to become an unstoppable mating force here. The rooks are going to get to the 7th rank, and that knight is attacking this pawn. It's going to come in, this is going to fall, and white is just winning in this position. Carlsen missed this, however. Instead of queen, after queen d6, instead of rook c2, he plays rook d1. And he was in a lot of time pressure on move 33 here in the first time control. Perhaps this move is designed to threaten the bishop, so the knight would be protecting the rook. After that, the bishop does take on a3, and Carlsen gets a pawn in return. Queen d7 was a nice, clever move here. That rook is under pressure, and it has no good squares to go to. If it moves along the 5th rank, then this pawn is going to fall because the knight is pinned. So it would have to move along the 2nd file here. But if it does that, then he gets into even worse trouble. For example, if he moves the rook to b6, same thing would happen if he moved it to b8. Black would attack that rook, and after he saves it, he would go down to c2, forking the knight and the rook, and white's going to lose material in this position. He can move the rook over and attack the bishop, and then after black takes the knight, he can take the pawn and attack the bishop, but the bishop gets out just fine, and black has a winning material advantage. Okay, so this does put pressure on the rook, and Carlsen has to decide what's the lesser evil here, and he decides to move his rook to c5. And now Nepo should probably just take the pawn on b4, because as we said, the knight is pinned. But maybe he's going for more with the move e5. I don't know if he wants to push that to e4. Carlsen moves the rook back to c2, and this gives black an opportunity to take on b4 again, which he doesn't do. And this time the engine really screams at him and says, no, you should have taken that pawn. Instead, he plays queen d5, and now Carlsen connects the rooks, and it's too late to take the pawn, because now the knight is no longer pinned, because the rooks are protecting each other. Okay, but queen to b3 comes, and then the rook comes over to the a file, And now another mistake by Jan. This position is equal now. He blew his small advantage earlier, but now he gives white an advantage after this move e4. So at this point, the engine says, well, you moved your queen here to attack this pawn. You got two attackers on it, so now you better take that pawn. Play bishop takes b4. Then white can exchange here. And white's perfectly safe because now you can really see the power of two rooks over a queen. Something the two rooks can do that the queen cannot is team up to attack something so that a pawn cannot be protected. So it's perfectly safe position, 4 pawns each on the king side, and it should be a draw according to the engine. So he should have taken that pawn. Instead, he pushes to e4. And then knight c5 was the correct response here. And now Jan tried taking the pawn now with the queen. But now Carlsen makes a mistake and takes on e4. What he's reasoning here is if black takes that knight, then he's going to get that bishop and again team up on that pawn. But this time it would be a 4-3 pawn on the king side, and these pawns would be weak. For example, that pawn could be targeted next after white wins the a pawn here, and there would be no way to defend it. So this would be winning for white. White gives us a +3. The engine gives white a +3.0 advantage. But instead of taking on e4, what black did was play queen to b3. Now going back here, right here, that knight takes e4 was a mistake, and instead the engine suggests a really subtle plan that's hard to find on your 40th move when you have a few seconds left on the clock and you're trying to make the time control. The engine suggests rook dc2 to just protect the knight, and there's a threat in the position. Let's see what would happen if black makes a non-move. Well, white would take that dangerous a pawn off the board. Looks impossible, but no, when the queen takes the knight, the bishop is pinned, and again, the rooks show their power. They team up and win the minor piece back. And this time, for some reason, with the 4 pawns each, the engine actually prefers white, +2.2 in this position. So it was a missed opportunity for Carlsen. Instead, he takes on e4. And Jan correctly does not take the knight. He just plays queen to b3, and then rook a c2. And this pawn is not going to go anywhere because these two rooks are going to hold it on the a2 square. So the players dance around for quite a while here. I won't really analyze any of these moves. Neither player's making progress. It's all zeros. Okay, here after knight d4, you have to wonder, is that knight heading to go over to take that pawn? Well, neither player thought so. After king h7, Carlsen just played king h2. If he went for the pawn with knight c2, then queen b3 is good, putting pressure on the rook on a2. And then if Carlsen took it, black would actually get an advantage after bishop e5, attacking the a1 rook. And if that rook moves, then the a2 rook falls. So that pawn was actually tactically protected. There's no real good way to go after it. So neither player worries about it. And now, for some reason, Jan abandons protection of his a pawn. I think he probably should have kept his queen on that pawn. If he kept his queen and bishop on that pawn, I don't think there's anything white could do. It just would have been a draw. But instead, black is going after this h-pawn because of a pin on the g-pawn here. And let's see what happens. Carlsen takes this pawn off the board, and that's actually another advantage of having the two rooks versus the queen. If there are other pieces on the board, like these minor pieces, if white has a reason, he can sack the exchange at any time because the remaining rook and knight here can continue to fight against the queen. So he has that option of sacking an exchange. But Jan takes on h4 with check, king g1, and now the queen is under attack, so it moves, and this allows white to move the rook. Okay, and then several more moves are played here without making progress. At this point, with this check, Carlsen makes a committal move that was criticized by Caruana during the commentary. He played f3, which, yeah, does look ugly when people point it out to me because it clears this second rank, making it harder for the white king to get shelter against checks later on, perhaps. Also, it weakens these two pawns, which are no longer protected, and black can have some targets. But Carlsen probably thought it was his only way to make any progress, to strive for a win, and I think he's still thinking win in this position, even though it's all zeros. And the engine says it's actually okay. Even though it looks ugly to humans, the engine says that move is still all zeros. Okay, queen d1, f4. Okay, white protects that first rank. Queen moves off. And now white gets the rook to e4 to protect this pawn on the e file, and that frees up this rook to move and maybe make some progress. Black is going to continue to pressure that pawn there to try to stop white from doing anything active. King g7. Okay, several moves here. And now there's a threat to win by queen to e1 check that's going to actually win if white allows it, so he has to protect against that, which he does. You have to remain vigilant even in a long game like this. Okay, and this move here puts the pressure back on e3 again, stopping white from taking on f5 because that pawn would fall with check. So the players continue to dance around for some time. We won't analyze all these moves. And right here, rook b5, attacking the bishop, and the bishop moves back. And now there's a battery on this f-pawn. Carlsen repeats moves here first and then takes that f-pawn. Queen d3, putting pressure back on e3 again, threatening to take there. But Carlsen actually comes up with a nice tactical move here, which allows him to press forward and continue to try to win this game. Otherwise, it's going to be a draw if he just has to go back and protect that pawn again. He plays rook takes f7 check, okay, giving up the rook in order to get this fork. And somehow Carlsen has managed to win the two f-pawns and the bishop for the cost of his rook. And now if anyone is going to win this position, it's white. I don't think black has anything here at all to go for. The engine says this is probably drawn, but with a rook, a knight, and three pawns versus a queen and a pawn, I'd much rather have white. Looks like a lot of pieces on the board to me. Okay, but queen d5, and Nepo plays this perfectly. According to the engine, white gets no advantage. The players dance around for quite a while. We'll just fly through these moves. Okay, no progress is being made. Carlsen eventually gets into a good defensive setup. Okay, right here, he wanted that knight on e2 to block against the checks, so he doesn't have to keep the rook on the second rank, and now the rook can become more active. It's still a drawn position. Okay, nothing going on. Now, after this pawn trade, count the number of pieces on the board. There's 7 pieces left, and that means we are now in endgame table-based territory. So you can actually look up this position for perfect play. You can see what the outcome is, and the table bases say this is a draw. And Jan holds it flawlessly for 15 moves. White is making no progress according to the table bases. It's always a draw here. Until this position. Now, black has to be very careful because according to the table bases, there are only 2 drawing moves, queen to b1 and queen to c2. I was listening to Ben Feingold's stream, and he remarked, I don't know why queen to b1 and queen to c2 are the only drawing moves. He doesn't see it. He thinks it's just random, and you can't really learn anything from table bases. They're more mathematical. They don't really play chess. He said something like he'd have to have a bunch of super GMs explain it to him. But then I listened for about 30 more seconds, and it was pretty funny because then he started to explain why queen to b1 and queen to c2 were the moves to make, and he kind of figured it out. And I don't think he proved it, but he did give some reason for those moves, and I'll repeat what he said. He said if you play queen b1 or queen c2, then those two moves have a dual purpose. One purpose is from either of those two squares, there's pressure on the rook, and that keeps the knight in place. The knight won't be able to move. Another reason to go to one of those two squares is because not only does it pressure the rook, but it simultaneously allows the queen to get to the d1 square, which is sometimes necessary to cover g4 to keep the king off of the g4 square. What white needs to do to make progress is get his king up. His king has to get up the board, he has to support the pawns have to push. So apparently black has to defend from behind like this. And here's a sample. If he had played queen b1, which Jan did not do, then let's try 2 tries here for white. If he tries to bring the king up now, then you can check him from d1, and if he tries to bring the king up any further, then you can pin the knight from g1 and attack it, forcing the king right back, and he's not making any progress. Or going back here after queen b1, maybe another try is rook g5, trying to defend the knight, allowing the king to get up. Like maybe now the king can slip out here, and if he gets checked, the rook would be defending the knight. Well, in that case, queen d1, stopping the king from going there. But the king can try to go up the h-file, but then there's queen e1, pinning the knight, and the knight can't move. Okay, so apparently this kind of pressure from behind, these pins, these checks, is enough to hold the draw. I'm not going to analyze it any deeper than that. It is very difficult. But Jan cracks here at move 130. He plays a losing move, queen to e6. But Carlsen still has to play precisely, and every move from here to the end of the game is a table-based winning move for Carlsen. He does not blow it. Okay, in fact, in this position, for example, there's only 2 winning moves, king h4, king g4, and Carlsen plays one of them. Okay, queen h6 was played. The knight blocks the check. Queen h7 attacking the rook. e6 ignoring it. Of course, he can ignore it because there's a fork here, a royal fork, and white would win. So he pushes the pawn, again, a table-based approved move. Queen g6, rook to f7, excellent. That was one of only 2 winning moves in the position. It looks like he's giving up the pawn, but he's not. If black takes the pawn, he loses like this. A royal fork again, but the king can take both pieces here. But luckily for white, this is a winning king and pawn endgame. The king has to come up. He's trying to get to one of the 3 key squares, so the black king has to defend them. But then white gains the opposition. The black king has to step aside. The white king goes up, and it's an easy, known win. Okay, so he's not really giving that pawn away with rook to f7. What he's doing is he's threatening to move the knight to g7 with check, and then he'll be controlling both of these squares, and the pawn will just push to promotion, and there won't be anything black can do about it. Black tries king d8. Let's look at another try before we see the game. Since white is threatening to play knight g7, I wondered what happens if black pins the knight and keeps it from moving. Well, in that case, there is f5, and then maybe black continues to keep that knight pinned, and then there is f6, and then maybe he continues to keep the knight pinned, but now those pawns are poised for this move because there's a mate threat on the back rank, and there's nothing black can do about it. He's going to get mated. Okay, so keeping that knight pinned and just waiting doesn't do anything, of course. So Jan plays king d8, and now f5. Since there actually was a threat on this pawn now, queen takes pawn because there's no more royal fork now that the king has left. We don't have that move. So he protects it, simultaneously attacking the queen. Logical move, table-based approved. There's really nothing to be done here. The queen falls back, maybe trying to check from behind. But then knight g7 comes, protecting the queening square, and these are white's next two moves if allowed. And black has no defense, so Jan resigned. The point is, if he tries to check, this king eventually will find some shelter. It's going to go hide on the g8 square. Then there are no more checks, and these are the next two moves. So epic game. Carlsen was incredibly elated, of course, to win this game because he's been trying to win a classical time control game in a world championship for quite some time. I think the last time he won one was, I think, game 10 against Karyakin in 2016. Because in 2018, it's known, everybody knows that when he played Caruana, there were all draws in the classical portion of the match. And so Carlsen has just broken that draw streak, and now he's in the driver's seat, and Jan has to do something about it. I look forward to more games. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something. I sure did.